The priest who slept with my wife shattered the last sanctuary I thought was safe, and I remember the moment I found out with such violent clarity that even now, years later, as I sit here with the ticking of my father's silver watch echoing in my palm, I can smell the faint ghost of incense clinging to my clothes and hear the hollow clang of the church bell that seemed to toll only for me that night. The memory has not dulled with time. If anything, it has sharpened, each edge cutting a little deeper, reminding me that betrayal is not a single wound but a splintering, a cracking of the soul that keeps spreading long after the initial break. It was not suspicion that drove me into the church rectory that evening, not jealousy or paranoia, but the most ordinary of errands, a forgotten wallet left behind after a parish fundraiser. I had worked for weeks on that fundraiser, collecting donations, printing flyers, setting up tables with my wife's help, all under the blessing of Father Matthew, the man I had thought of as a shepherd, a confidant, almost family. I had trusted him enough to let him into my home, into the private creases of my marriage, into the sacred fabric of our lives. And yet when I stepped into that hallway, the air warm and perfumed with candle wax and spilled red wine, what I found unraveled all of it in an instant. The door to his study was ajar, not wide enough to invite entry but just enough to leak laughter into the corridor. It was laughter that froze me, not the hearty communal laugh of shared faith or the playful chuckle of old friends, but something quieter, more dangerous. Laughter meant only for two. I remember standing there for several seconds, rooted to the floor, my hand tightening around the edge of my father's watch in my pocket, as if the metal could anchor me against the rising tide of unease, against my better judgment. I pushed the door wider, and in that sliver of space the world I knew collapsed. There she was, my wife, the woman I had loved and built a life with for 15 years, leaning toward him, her red silk scarf coiled in his fingers like a shared secret. His clerical collar, that symbol of his vows, was loosened, and his lips grazed her hand with the casual tenderness of a man who had already long since crossed the forbidden line. They did not hear me at first. Time seemed to pause. The watch ticked in my pocket, loud as thunder, and all I could think was how absurdly small the detail was that gave them away. Her scarf, the one I had given her for our anniversary. I had spent weeks saving for it, remembering how she once paused in a shop window admiring it, how her eyes had lit up when I surprised her with it, how she had wrapped it around her neck on cold mornings, and now here it was, clutched in the hand of another man, a man who claimed to represent God. When they finally noticed me, the silence that followed was heavier than any words they could have spoken. My wife's face drained of color, her lips parted, but no apology came. Father Matthew's jaw tightened, his eyes narrowing with a guilt he tried to mask behind a priest's solemn calm. No explanations, no fumbling excuses, just silence, as if the weight of the sin was too enormous to fit into language. I staggered back, my throat dry, my mind a blur of fragments. Her laughter, his hand, the scarf, the smell of wine and incense pressed down on me like a suffocating fog. I turned and stumbled out, into the night, the cool air hitting my face with a cruelty that felt almost mocking. Behind me, their whispers began, hurried, panicked, but they were only echoes carried on the wind. I could not make out the words, and perhaps I didn't need to. The truth was already carved into me. I remember walking down the empty street toward my house, each step heavier than the last, the bell from the church tower tolling in the distance like some cruel reminder of judgment, and with every toll, the sound of my father's watch seemed to sync with it, ticking against my thigh like the heartbeat of a truth I could not escape. That watch, it had been my inheritance, the one object I kept close always, not for its value but for the weight of memory it carried. My father had worn it through hard years, through storms of poverty and doubt, and in giving it to me he had said, "This will remind you that every second counts, son. Use it to measure your life, not waste it." That night, as the seconds crawled forward, I realized I was measuring not life but death, the death of trust, the death of faith, the death of the man I thought I was. The strange thing is, I had been warned. I think back now to that old parishioner, Mr. Gallagher, a stooped man with eyes like cloudy glass, who once pulled me aside when Father Matthew first arrived in town. His voice had been hoarse, like gravel, but his words were sharp. "Run while you can. They're not who they seem." I had laughed then, chalked it up to bitterness, to the resistance of an old man clinging to the past. But as I trudged home that night, my chest burning and my hands trembling, his words replayed in my mind like a curse. They had not been paranoia, they had been prophecy. When I reached the house, I sat at the kitchen table in the dark, the watch ticking on the wood before me. My wife would not come home for another hour, and when she did, she would pretend nothing had happened, her lies rehearsed behind a mask of weary smiles. But I would already know. The knowledge sat inside me like a splinter lodged too deep to remove, each breath catching on it. I stared at that watch, at the hands crawling forward in their endless circle, and I thought of all the circles we walk blindly in life, the circle of trust, the circle of ritual, the circle of faith, and I realized mine had been broken, shattered by the very people I had trusted most. I did not weep that night. I did not shout or break dishes, or storm back to the rectory. I sat still, watching the seconds crawl, and felt something colder than grief take root. Not hatred, not yet, not rage, something quieter, more patient, the seed of revenge curling like smoke in my gut, whispering to me that this sin would not go unanswered, that every secret has its reckoning, that even a priest cannot outrun his darkest sin forever. And in that silence, with the watch ticking on, I promised myself I would see it through. The night passed slowly, the shadows stretching long, and by dawn, I knew I was no longer the man who had left his wallet in the church hall. I was someone else now, someone marked. I did not know then what form my vengeance would take, or how far I would go, but I knew one thing: the priest who slept with my wife had torn open a wound that could never be closed by forgiveness. My story, our story, had already shifted into something darker, and though I dreaded what it might cost me, I also understood, in some quiet corner of my heart, that I was already walking the road of no return. And as I sat there, listening to the first bird song of morning, I thought back to the beginning, our wedding day, Father Matthew's blessing, my wife's vows, and felt the cruel irony of it all pressing down on me. That memory would haunt me in the days to come, and it is where my mind will turn next, as I unravel how love, trust, and faith had all conspired to blind me, until the night the truth came crashing down. It is strange how memory works, how on the night of betrayal the mind does not only replay the wound itself, but drags you backward, forcing you to relive the very moments that make the wound so sharp. And so, as I sat at that kitchen table with my father's watch ticking between my fingers, I found myself pulled back to the day of our wedding, to the sunlit church where we stood trembling but smiling, my wife in her white dress, myself in a suit I could barely afford, and Father Matthew at the altar, younger then, his voice strong and steady as he intoned the vows that would one day collapse under his own hypocrisy. I can still see the light streaming through the stained glass windows, reds and blues spilling across the pews like fragments of heaven, the scent of lilies heavy in the air, the music swelling as we said, "I do." That moment had seemed untouchable, a sacred beginning, and yet now I realize it had been the first stone laid in the long path to betrayal, because it was Father Matthew's presence, his blessing, that sanctified our bond in the eyes of the community, and in doing so, it gave him a claim to a place in our lives that would grow larger with every passing year. I thought then he was a man of God, a shepherd, a guide for our souls, but looking back, I see how easily trust can be weaponized, how effortlessly intimacy can be smuggled in under the cover of faith. In the years after our wedding, he became a fixture, not just of the parish but of our home. At baptisms, christenings, Sunday dinners, he was there, welcomed without hesitation. I remember evenings when he sat at our table, laughing over roast chicken, blessing the food before we dug in, his voice solemn and kind, while my wife poured him wine and my children listened to his stories with wide eyes. He knew how to speak to people, how to make each person feel chosen, noticed, beloved. That was his gift, or perhaps his weapon. My father's watch would tick in my pocket as I sat across from him, a symbol of continuity, of trust passed down from generation to generation, and I never once doubted that the man seated across from me was worthy of that trust. I had been taught from boyhood to respect priests, to see them as second fathers, and so I ignored the way he sometimes let his hand linger too long when touching a shoulder, or the way his gaze sometimes softened when it fell on my wife, mistaking it for pastoral warmth. The truth is, she adored him too. How could she not? He was charismatic, articulate, quick with a joke, and quicker with sympathy. When her mother died, he was the one who sat with her in the pew after hours, letting her cry against his shoulder. When our first child was born, he was at the hospital within the hour, blessing the boy and kissing his forehead. When money was tight, he gave advice about patience, about faith enduring through trials. All of it seemed like generosity, like spiritual fatherhood, and maybe for a time, it was. But now, looking back, I cannot untangle where sincerity ended and temptation began. It is like trying to find the exact moment when dusk becomes night. The boundary slips away even as you search for it. I remember one Christmas in particular, the first after our daughter was born. The house was filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine, the children buzzing with excitement as we lit candles and sang hymns. Father Matthew came that night, bringing gifts wrapped in gold paper, laughing as he handed them out. For my son, a wooden toy train; for my daughter, a small silver cross; for my wife, a book of poetry she had once mentioned in passing. I had forgotten that she even loved that poet, but he had remembered. She blushed when she opened it, her eyes shining, and I thought nothing of it then. How could I? He was attentive, thoughtful, generous. Only now do I see that those moments were not innocent kindness but seeds, each one planting a familiarity that would later blossom into betrayal. It is almost unbearable to recall these things now, but I must, because to understand the depth of my wound, you must first understand the height of my trust. I had given him everything: my respect, my home, my family. I defended him when others in town muttered rumors, when Mr. Gallagher whispered that warning, "Run while you can, they're not who they seem." I told myself those words were nothing but bitterness, that Father Matthew was a new broom, sweeping through the parish, shaking up traditions, stirring discomfort. I even told my wife, chuckling about it over dinner, and she had shaken her head, agreeing that people clung to suspicion when they feared change. How naive I was, how blind. The truth had been right before me, spoken plainly, and I had laughed it away. Faith is a strange thing. It blinds and it reveals, it comforts and it condemns. I wanted so badly to believe that God had given us a shepherd, that our marriage had been sanctified by his blessing, that our home was enriched by his friendship, that I closed my eyes to the truth. When I replay those early years, I can see the cracks forming, though at the time they looked like blessings. I see the way my wife's laughter grew warmer when he was around, the way she leaned forward when he spoke, the way her eyes lingered. I see how he sought her counsel on parish matters, calling her late in the evening, asking for her thoughts as though she were indispensable. I told myself it was respect, that he valued her intellect, and I was proud. Only now do I see it for what it was: a courtship carried out under the guise of faith, a slow seduction wrapped in scripture. There was one night, years before the truth revealed itself, when I found them in the garden talking long after the party had ended. It was autumn, the air crisp, the leaves crunching underfoot, and I had gone to fetch my father's watch from the shed, where I had left it during repairs. As I passed the hedge, I heard their voices, low and earnest, not the light chatter of acquaintances, but something more intimate. She was laughing softly, and he was telling her about his doubts, his struggles, confessing things a priest might not even admit in the confessional. I almost interrupted, but something stopped me. I told myself it was respect, that they needed their moment of friendship, that it was good she had someone to lean on. I never questioned it, and perhaps that was the greatest sin of all: my own blindness, my own willingness to look away. But blindness does not excuse betrayal. It only makes the knife cut deeper when it finally arrives. That night at the kitchen table, after seeing the scarf in his hands, I realized that all those years of trust, of dinners, of shared laughter and blessings, had only been a prologue to this moment. Every gift he had given, every prayer he had spoken, every kindness he had shown, now looked different in the harsh light of truth, not gestures of faith, but steps in a slow dance of deceit, and the memory of our wedding, once my most cherished, had become unbearable. Because now, every time I see the photograph of us standing before him, my wife in her gown, myself beaming, his hands raised in blessing, I can only think of how he was not blessing us but binding us to him, tightening invisible strings that would one day strangle me. I suppose that is why I cannot let this go, why forgiveness was never an option. To forgive him would be to erase all those years, to tell myself they had meant nothing, when in truth they meant everything. They were the rope he used to climb into my home, into my marriage, into my wife's heart. No, forgiveness is too small, too weak for what has been done. And as the watch ticked on that night, I knew that I could not simply grieve. I had to act. I had to make sure that the man who stood at the altar that day, the man who claimed to be a servant of God, would be seen for what he truly was. It is not easy even now to reconcile the man I thought he was with, the man he revealed himself to be. The memories clash inside me, jostling like shadows against light, and sometimes I wonder if I am remembering them truthfully, or if betrayal has colored them beyond recognition. But whether he meant it from the start, or whether temptation consumed him later, the end is the same. The priest who married us, who blessed our children, who ate at our table, was the same priest who slept with my wife, and knowing that, I cannot help but feel that the story of my life has split into two, before the scarf, before the doorway, before the silence and after. And so as I sat there, the dawn breaking through the window, the watch's tick syncing with the rising sun, I realized the only way to understand the depth of what I faced was to retrace each step, to study each memory like evidence, to see clearly at last the pattern I had been too blind to acknowledge. That decision, to examine the past for its hidden truths, was the first step on the path I would walk, the path that would lead me from shock into investigation, from memory into action. Because once you admit to yourself that the life you built was a lie, the only question that remains is what will you do about it? The truth, once spoken aloud, never fades into silence again. It lingers, seeps into the marrow, and makes itself a permanent inhabitant of the soul. When Michael staggered back to his home after the confession that shattered him, he found no refuge waiting in the walls of his house, no sanctuary in the familiar smell of his wife's cooking or the laughter of his children. Instead, he found the sharp awareness that every smile Sarah had once given him, every touch, every whispered good night, was now smeared with the stain of betrayal. He sat alone in the dim kitchen, a single bulb buzzing above his head, and replayed the priest's words, not as a confession, but as a blade. Father Adrian's voice, measured, soft, deceitfully calm, echoed in his mind, "Forgive me, for I have sinned." Michael had heard confessions his whole life from others, through stories or whispered secrets, but never had he imagined the man he once trusted with the fate of his soul would confess to desecrating his marriage bed. The kettle on the stove whistled faintly, but Michael did not rise to silence it. He sat rigid, hands clenched, knowing in that moment that forgiveness was not the path before him. Vengeance was. But vengeance is never simple, never quick. It cannot be picked up and executed like the swing of an axe. It must be cultivated, nurtured in silence, like a poison brewed slowly over flame. Michael knew this as clearly as he knew the creak of his wooden floors. To rush would mean exposure, and exposure would give Sarah and Adrian the chance to twist truth into lies, to make him the madman, the jealous husband who invented stories to soothe his wounded pride. No, his revenge would be the opposite of their sin. Their act had been hasty, reckless, driven by lust. His would be patient, meticulous, born not from impulse but from calculation. And so, as he sat in that dim kitchen, the whistle of the kettle breaking into silence when the water boiled away, Michael began to imagine not merely retribution, but the destruction of two people who had chosen to dismantle his life. He would not just punish them, he would expose them. He began quietly, almost invisibly, as if moving through the shadows of his own home. The first step was knowledge. He started noticing Sarah's excuses, her late nights under the guise of church gatherings, the way she avoided his eyes at the dinner table when the children asked where she had been. Michael learned the rhythm of her lies, the cadence of the pauses between her words, and he matched them against the hollow ring of Adrian's sermons. The priest spoke of purity, of loyalty, of keeping oneself unsullied before God. Yet Michael could see the twitch in his jaw, the bead of sweat that formed too quickly on his forehead when Sarah's name arose in parish conversation. Each detail, each inconsistency, Michael recorded silently in his mind, turning them into threads he could one day weave into a noose. He knew truth alone was not enough. Truth needed timing, context, and audience to strike like lightning. Without these, it would dissipate into the air as just another rumor, and priests knew how to cloak rumors with scripture. As weeks passed, Michael's demeanor shifted. Outwardly, he remained the same dutiful husband, the same parishioner, the man who shook Father Adrian's hand after Sunday Mass. But beneath, he was transforming into something colder, sharper, like iron forged in fire. The children noticed a quietness in him that unsettled them, though they could not name it. Sarah, wrapped in her own guilty secret, barely noticed the change. Her own shame and desire blinded her. But Adrian noticed. Priests are trained to sense the unspoken, and one evening after Mass, as the parishioners filed out into the cool night air, Adrian lingered near Michael, placing a hand on his shoulder, as though to test the waters. "Are you well, my son?" he asked, his voice warm, yet behind it lingered the shadow of fear. Michael turned his gaze toward him, his eyes steady, unblinking, and answered with a softness that chilled, "I am watching, Father, always watching." Those words were enough to rattle Adrian, though Sarah laughed when he told her later. "He's only jealous," she whispered, dismissing Michael's quiet intensity as wounded pride. But deep down, Adrian could not shake the feeling that he had underestimated the man he had betrayed, and Michael knew he had planted the first seed of doubt in the priest's heart. He would water that doubt slowly, carefully, until it grew into terror. At night, when the house was quiet and Sarah slept beside him with her back turned, Michael would lie awake and imagine the moment when both she and Adrian would face the weight of their sin in front of all who once believed in them. He pictured the church congregation gasping, the murmurs rising like a storm, Sarah's face paling, Adrian's mask of piety shattering into panic. These visions were the fuel that kept him patient, that kept his vengeance cold rather than reckless. He would strike not when they expected it, not in private, but in the open, where humiliation would burn hotter than any secret punishment. His rage was no longer blind. It had found its clarity in the theater of exposure. But for all his planning, for all his careful movements, Michael was not without weakness. There were nights when the anger consumed him so fully he wanted to shake Sarah awake, demand that she look him in the eye, and admit it. There were mornings when the sight of Adrian standing at the altar, robes gleaming, hands raised in blessing, made his own hands twitch with the desire to tear the cloth from the priest's body and reveal the man beneath, the liar, the hypocrite. It was only by biting down on his own impulses, by tasting the bitter iron of restraint, that Michael kept himself steady. Each act of self-control hardened him further, turning him from a wounded husband into something far more dangerous, a strategist. The silence of his suffering became its own weapon. Sarah grew more careless, believing his quiet meant surrender. Adrian grew bolder in his sermons, believing his calm meant blindness. And all the while, Michael's heart hardened into something unrecognizable even to himself. The man who once prayed at the foot of the altar, asking for guidance, no longer sought heaven's help. He had abandoned forgiveness and faith alike, replacing them with a new creed that betrayal demands repayment, and love once broken must be avenged. And as the nights grew colder, and autumn's winds swept through the village. Michael knew the time was drawing nearer. His plan was no longer a vague dream. It was taking form, detail by detail, like the careful brushstrokes of a painter building toward his masterpiece. Soon, very soon, Sarah and Adrian would learn what it meant to betray a man who had given them everything. They thought their sin was hidden in shadows, but Michael was ready to drag it into the light, and once exposed, neither of them would ever walk in dignity again. Michael had sharpened his anger into resolve, and now that the plan had taken shape in his mind, it was no longer enough to sit in silence and dream of humiliation. He needed to begin laying the groundwork. Every masterpiece of destruction requires a foundation, and his would be built not on shouting accusations, but on evidence, whispers, and the turning of the very community that once held Adrian in reverence. If Adrian's power came from the trust of his flock, then Michael's weapon would be the slow, deliberate erosion of that trust. The image of Sarah and Adrian dragged into the light was no longer just a fantasy, it was a destination. And as autumn darkened into early winter, Michael began to move. The first step was subtle, observation disguised as devotion. He attended every mass, every gathering, every church supper, standing quietly in corners, never drawing attention, but always watching. People trust those who appear faithful, those who blend into the background with bowed heads and folded hands. Michael understood this instinctively. He learned when Adrian spoke with too much warmth to Sarah, how long his gaze lingered on her when he thought no one was looking. He noticed which parishioners muttered about the priest's sudden late-night absences, which women in the pews frowned when Adrian's sermons leaned too heavily into the dangers of temptation. Every look, every slip of the tongue, Michael catalogued. It was not enough for him to know. He needed others to begin to see. He planted the smallest seeds first, for seeds grow best when no one notices the hand that sows them. At a supper hosted by the church, as parishioners passed plates of bread and steaming stews, Michael leaned casually toward one of the older men in the congregation, Mr. Donnelly, whose sharp tongue had never shied from gossip. "Strange, isn't it?" Michael murmured, just loud enough to be overheard. "Father Adrian always seems so tired these days. I suppose the Lord's work keeps him up long into the night." The words were harmless on the surface, but Donnelly's eyes narrowed. His suspicions stirred. Within a week, whispers of the priest's exhaustion rippled among the congregation. Michael said nothing further, letting suspicion germinate on its own. At home, Sarah remained unaware. She had mistaken Michael's silence for surrender, believing his passivity meant he was broken beyond repair. She hummed as she set the table, brushed her hair before the mirror, and rehearsed her excuses with less care. But Michael noticed everything. He noticed when her phone lit up in the middle of the night, when her blouse was buttoned too hastily in the morning, when her perfume lingered just a little too strong after her supposed women's study groups. Each detail became a brick in the case he was building, a structure of undeniable truth that would one day crush her. He kept his anger carefully banked, showing no sign that he knew, for nothing would serve him better than their belief in his blindness. Meanwhile, Adrian's unease grew. Michael could see it in the way the priest glanced at him after Mass, as though measuring whether he knew too much. Adrian's sermons grew more desperate, more theatrical, hammering on sin and forgiveness with the fervor of a man trying to drown his own conscience. Michael watched and smiled inwardly, for a desperate man makes mistakes, and mistakes were exactly what Michael was waiting for. One evening, as the wind howled through the trees and rain lashed against the church windows, Michael lingered after Mass, pretending to tidy hymnals while others left. Sarah had gone on ahead, but Adrian remained, wiping the chalice with trembling hands. Michael approached, his steps deliberate, his face calm. "You look tired, Father," he said softly. Adrian glanced up, startled, searching his eyes for meaning. "You should take care of yourself. A man who carries too many secrets tends to lose sleep." The silence that followed stretched like a blade between them. Adrian opened his mouth, but no words came. Michael simply smiled, set down the hymnal, and walked away, leaving the priest rooted in dread. It was a game now, and Michael had no intention of losing, but games cannot remain in shadows forever. To bring Adrian and Sarah to ruin, Michael needed more than whispers and insinuations. He needed proof that no tongue could deny. He began quietly recording Sarah's late-night phone calls, slipping a small recorder into the pocket of her purse before she left for her meetings. He searched her phone when she left it unattended, gathering messages, times, places. The evidence he collected was damning, but Michael did not rush to reveal it. Proof is only powerful when unveiled at the precise moment of greatest impact. Like a stage magician, he would keep his cards hidden until the crowd leaned forward, desperate to see the trick revealed. At the same time, he began cultivating allies. His sister Margaret, a sharp-witted woman with a reputation for speaking the truth, became his quiet confidant. He did not tell her everything, not yet, but enough to stoke her suspicion. "You ever notice," he said one evening as they washed dishes together, "how Sarah seems closer to the church than to her own family these days?" Margaret frowned, drying a plate with deliberate slowness. "Closer to Adrian, you mean?" Michael said nothing, only shrugged, letting her finish the thought herself. Margaret's suspicion grew quickly, and once she began watching, others followed. Within weeks, the whispers that had begun as faint ripples turned into steady undercurrents. Still, Michael restrained himself. Timing was everything. The plan was no longer just revenge, it was theater, and he was the playwright. Each act had to unfold in order: suspicion, tension, revelation, collapse. To reveal the truth too soon would rob the finale of its power. And so, he endured the quiet torment of living beside Sarah, knowing her every smile was a lie, her every touch a betrayal. He endured Adrian's pious performances at the altar, his voice rising in praise even as his soul was steeped in filth. Every moment of endurance was fuel, every second of silence a promise to himself. Their destruction would be total, and it would be public. As winter deepened and Christmas approached, Michael knew the stage was nearly set. The church would be packed for the holiday mass. The entire congregation gathered in reverence and celebration. What better place, what better moment, to tear away their masks? He could already hear the gasps, see the faces turning, feel the air shift when the truth exploded into the sacred silence. His heart pounded at the thought, not with fear, but with anticipation. The day was coming. Soon Sarah and Adrian's darkest sin would no longer be whispered in shadows. It would stand naked before the world. The silence in the church was thick enough to choke on. Every eye fixed on me as I rose from the pew, my wife's hand brushing against my sleeve, as if to tug me back down, her whisper sharp and panicked. "Michael, sit." But I did not sit. I stood, steady as stone, the silver watch in my palm ticking audibly in my ears, its rhythm louder than the carols, louder than the crackling of candles. Father Adrian's face had gone pale beneath the glow of the altar lights, his words frozen in his throat, the mighty shepherd suddenly a cornered man. I looked at him, not with rage but with a terrible calm, and I let my voice carry through the vaulted space. "You speak of mercy," I said, my tone low but unshakable. "But what mercy did you show when you crossed the threshold of my home, when you laid your hands on what was not yours, when you betrayed the vows you swore before God and man?" A gasp rippled through the pews, a sound like the wind rushing through autumn leaves, and I knew then that I had their attention, that the curtain had finally lifted. Adrian opened his mouth, but no words came, only a tremor in his lips, his hand clutching the edge of the pulpit, as if to steady himself. Sarah's grip tightened on my arm, her nails digging into my skin, her whisper now frantic, "Michael, stop this, not here." But I shook her off, my gaze never leaving the priest. "You stopped being a man of God," I said, louder this time, each syllable deliberate. "The moment you betrayed my family." The words cut through the sanctuary like a blade, and with them the murmurs began, first soft, then growing, as the congregation turned their heads between us, piecing together the implications, the scandal, the sin. Adrian tried to lift his voice, to stammer some defense, but his congregation was no longer listening to him. They were listening to me. I reached into my coat, and withdrew the folder I had carried with me. A simple leather case, unremarkable in appearance, but heavy with proof. My heart pounded, but my hands did not shake as I opened it and held up the first page. Photocopies of messages exchanged between Sarah and Adrian. Words of intimacy that had no place between priest and parishioner. Gasps broke the silence again, sharper now, tinged with outrage. I let them read, their eyes scanning the words I had highlighted in bold, words that could not be misinterpreted. I turned the next page. Receipts, hotel bookings, times and dates that coincided with Sarah's study groups, and finally the recordings. I had spliced together snippets of Sarah's voice, Adrian's voice, their words unmistakable in their implication. When I pressed play on the small recorder, the sound of Adrian's laughter filled the church, intimate and damning. Sarah's face collapsed in horror, her hands flying to her mouth, tears springing unbidden to her eyes. Adrian's knees seemed to buckle, his hand slipping from the pulpit, his composure cracking as the weight of evidence crushed him. He stammered, This is taken out of context, lies, fabrications," but no one believed him. The whispers swelled into outrage, voices rising in disbelief, in anger, in betrayal. The man they had trusted with their confessions, their marriages, their children's baptisms, unmasked before their very eyes. Mrs. Donnelly was the first to stand, pointing a trembling finger at him. "Shame," she hissed, her voice shaking with fury. "Shame on you," others echoed, some weeping, some shouting. All of them turned against him now. Adrian tried to speak over them, to reclaim control, but every word he uttered rang hollow. The louder he protested, the clearer it became that his power was gone. Margaret, my sister, rose to her feet on the other side of the pews, her sharp voice cutting through the clamor. "How dare you preach to us of sin, Father Adrian, when you wallowed in it yourself? How many of us have sat in that confessional, pouring out our hearts, while you carried on with this betrayal behind closed doors?" Her words ignited the crowd further, the dam of respect and silence broken. I stood in the center, steady, the folder still in my hand, the watch ticking in my pocket, watching as the fire spread exactly as I had planned. Sarah collapsed into the pew, her shoulders shaking, her face buried in her hands. I felt no triumph watching her fall apart, only the grim certainty that this was the cost of truth. She had made her choice long ago, and now it had caught up with her. Adrian, however, still clung desperately to the remnants of his authority, his voice hoarse as he shouted above the chaos. "Brothers and sisters, you must not be deceived. This is the devil's work, an attack on your shepherd." But his words only drew jeers, the congregation shouting him down, some demanding he step down immediately, others calling for the bishop, still others muttering that the police should be called. He had lost them, utterly and completely, and the look in his eyes told me he knew it. I could have stopped there. I could have walked away, content with the ruin I had unleashed. But I wasn't finished. I stepped forward, my voice once again rising above the din. "This man," I said, pointing to Adrian, "entered my home under the guise of trust. He comforted my wife while she claimed to seek counsel, and he defiled both his vows and my marriage. For years he has preached of sin while living in it himself, and I will not stand silent while my family and my faith are torn apart by his deceit." My words rang with finality, and in them I felt the culmination of all the sleepless nights, the gathering of evidence, the careful plotting. This was the moment I had promised myself, and I had not faltered. The service dissolved into chaos, people rising from their pews, some crying, some furious, some leaving in disgust. Adrian tried to retreat, but parishioners blocked his path, their faces twisted with betrayal. Sarah sat motionless, her red scarf slipping from her shoulders, crumpled in her lap like a discarded flag. I turned away from them both, no longer needing to watch. My revenge was not in their suffering. It was in the truth itself, spoken aloud and undeniable. As I walked toward the doors, the cold night air rushing to meet me, I felt Margaret fall into step beside me. She said nothing, only slipped her hand into mine for a brief moment, a silent acknowledgement that the battle was over. Outside, the bells began to toll midnight, announcing Christmas Day. Their sound was no longer sweet to me, but heavy, resonant, almost mournful. I paused on the steps of the church, pulling out my father's silver watch, its hands perfectly aligned with the bells. The timing had been exact, down to the very second. The seed of revenge I had carried had blossomed fully into revelation, and though my heart was heavy, I knew there was no turning back. Behind me, the voices of the congregation still rose in turmoil, a storm that would not soon pass. Adrian's darkest sin had been dragged into the light, and now it would consume him. The days after that revelation moved like molasses, each hour dragging with a heaviness that pressed against Daniel's ribs, suffocating him in silence that he could neither bear nor escape. And yet it was in that silence that he began piecing together what little fragments of truth still made sense to him. He had thought the worst was already behind him when Anna confessed her sin, but the quiet after her admission held something more venomous, a shadow that whispered to him in the dark, a truth that seemed larger than the simple betrayal of flesh. And as Daniel sat at the kitchen table one evening, staring at the clock that had not ticked for days because no one had bothered to wind it, he realized that the story was not finished, that the wound still bled beneath the surface, unseen but alive, and it would not heal until he unearthed everything that had been buried. He told himself that if Anna had lied once, she could have lied again, and the priest, Father Samuel, had not spoken a single word to him since the confrontation, as though retreating into his pulpit would absolve him of guilt. But Daniel could feel that man's shadow everywhere in the hush of the chapel, in the echoes of whispered prayers, in the hollowed faces of those who still trusted him with their souls, and the thought curdled into rage. Daniel could not yet decide whether to confront Samuel publicly, to rip off the mask of sanctity that he wore, or whether to wait and learn more. But what he knew with a certainty that thrummed in his bones was that this was not only about his marriage anymore, it was about the corruption of a man who preached of virtue while feasting on sin. Yet, even as his heart seethed with thoughts of vengeance, Daniel found himself remembering the night Anna had broken down at the table, the way her body shook with shame, and her voice cracked like glass, and a part of him still longed to reach for her hand, to remember what it had felt like when they were younger, when their love had been untouchable, when the world seemed to conspire to keep them together. That longing was dangerous, and he knew it because it threatened to dull the edge of his anger, to make him forget the insult that had been done, not just to him, but to every vow they had once whispered beneath stained glass. He hated himself for still loving her, and yet that love became a chain that tethered him, a cruel reminder that he was not free, not from her, not from Samuel, not from the weight of the betrayal that bound them all together. He spent long nights pacing the floor of his study, unable to sleep, rehearsing words he might say, speeches he might give, scenes of exposure he might orchestrate. But each time he thought of bringing Samuel's sin into the light, he saw Anna's face, pale and broken, and he faltered, for he wondered if revenge would destroy her more completely than her confession already had. The conflict clawed at him, shredding the remnants of peace he had left, until finally, one rain-drenched evening, he decided he would seek truth, not from Anna, not from Samuel, but from the parish itself, from those who had unknowingly been part of this web of deceit. The following Sunday, he dressed in his finest suit, not out of reverence but as armor, and walked with Anna to the church where the bell tolled with the same hollow note it always had, though now it seemed to Daniel like a summons to judgment. The pews were filled with familiar faces, neighbors who nodded politely, friends who bowed their heads in prayer, all blind to the hypocrisy standing at the altar. Samuel's voice rose in cadence, rich with practiced sincerity, but Daniel no longer heard the words as holy. He heard them as lies, gilded and rehearsed, a performance meant to soothe the innocent, while the guilty feasted behind closed doors. He studied Samuel's eyes, searching for a flicker of guilt, but the priest's gaze was steady, serene, as though untouched by sin. It enraged him further, and Daniel clenched his fists beneath the hymnal, forcing himself not to rise and tear down the illusion in front of everyone. He needed more than anger. He needed proof, and so, when the service ended, and the crowd spilled out into the sunlight, Daniel lingered, watching Samuel retreat into the vestry, and a thought rooted itself firmly in his mind. If truth would not reveal itself willingly, he would dig it out of the earth with his own hands. That night, he confronted Anna again, not with accusation this time, but with questions, sharp and pointed like knives carefully placed on the table. He asked her how long it had gone on, how many times she had gone to Samuel's side, whether it had been love or merely lust, and though she wept and begged him not to force her to relive it, Daniel insisted, his voice steady with the cold resolve of a man who had already lost everything worth losing. Her answers came in fragments, halting and choked with shame, but through her broken confessions, Daniel began to see a darker pattern, threads of manipulation woven into her story, as if Samuel had not only taken her body but her weakness, her fears, her loneliness, and used them against her. Anna admitted that he had counseled her when Daniel was away working, that his words had sounded like comfort, but soon became chains, that he had spoken of her beauty when she felt invisible, of her goodness when she felt damned, and though she resisted at first, eventually, she was drawn to him like a moth to the flame. It was not only betrayal, it was exploitation, and in that realization, Daniel's anger deepened into something colder, something that sharpened into purpose. Now Daniel knew what he must do. This was not a private wound anymore, not simply a matter of marital betrayal. It was the rod of a man who stood above others, and twisted their faith for his own hunger. He could not let it fester in silence. Yet he also knew that to expose Samuel would mean to expose Anna, to drag her shame into the light of the community, to stain her name as surely as it would stain Samuel's, and the question of whether he could bear to do that haunted him. But as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, as the moonlight traced faint silver across the walls, he thought of every family in the parish, every wife who knelt in confession, every daughter who sought counsel, and he shuddered with the fear of what Samuel might do if left unchecked. He realized with bitter clarity that his choice was no longer between his love for Anna and his thirst for vengeance. It was between protecting his wife's dignity or protecting the entire flock from the wolf hiding in shepherd's clothing. That choice, though impossible, was already made in his heart. So when dawn came, gray and weary, Daniel rose with a new resolve. He would begin quietly, gathering whispers, collecting stories, piecing together the hidden trail of Samuel's sins, and he would not stop until the truth was undeniable. As he left the house, Anna's eyes followed him, hollow with dread, but Daniel said nothing, for words between them had become fragile things, liable to shatter if handled too roughly. He only carried with him the weight of betrayal, the fire of purpose, and the cold, certain knowledge that the priest's darkest sin had only just begun to unravel. Daniel began his search for truth quietly, almost invisibly, slipping into conversations where trust ran deep and suspicion was low, his words carefully chosen so as not to reveal too much of what he already knew. He spoke to parishioners in the marketplace, to neighbors at the well, to old friends who remembered the days when Samuel was still a young priest, and though most offered only idle chatter, now and then a note of unease would creep into their voices, a hesitation, a story half told before it was quickly withdrawn. One woman, her hands rough from years of work, admitted that her niece had stopped attending confession after Samuel scolded her too harshly, though she wouldn't explain what the girl had confessed. Another man, an elder of the church, muttered that Samuel's late-night visits to certain homes were troubling, though he cautioned Daniel not to speak of it, for such talk could ruin reputations. These fragments, scattered and fragile, began to knit together into a tapestry of unease, one that Daniel could not ignore. It was as though the community had long sensed something wrong, but had chosen silence, the way people do when their faith is too deeply entangled with fear. As he gathered these whispers, Daniel felt the weight of secrecy pressing harder against him, for each revelation was both a comfort and a burden. A comfort because it proved his pain was not an isolated wound, and a burden because it meant others had been touched by the same corruption. He kept notes in a small leather journal, scrawled by candlelight in the solitude of his study, where the scratching of the pen became a ritual of resolve. Each entry marked another thread pulled loose from Samuel's carefully woven facade. Yet Daniel knew that whispers alone would not topple a man of the cloth. The parishioners might grumble in private, but without proof, without undeniable testimony, Samuel's robes would protect him, shielding his sins behind the illusion of holiness. Anna watched him with haunted eyes as his search deepened, saying little, though her silence was louder than any words. She knew what path he had set himself upon, and perhaps she feared the end of it as much as Samuel himself might. Still, Daniel could not stop, not now, not when he had already glimpsed the breadth of Samuel's shadow. One night, as he closed his journal and blew out the lamp, he whispered into the darkness, "Your sin is no longer yours alone, Father. It belongs to every soul you've touched, every vow you've broken, and I will not rest until it's brought into the light." And with that vow still warm in his chest, Daniel lay down, already plotting the next step, already reaching toward the deeper truths that lay hidden, waiting for him to uncover them. The whispers alone were not enough, Daniel knew. Suspicion had a way of dissolving under the weight of Samuel's sermons, and rumor could always be dismissed as malice. What he needed was something solid, something he could place before the world and say, "Here is the truth you can no longer ignore." That moment came one rain-slick evening when Daniel, restless and unable to sleep, walked the road past the rectory, his father's silver watch heavy in his palm, ticking like a reminder that time for justice was running short. The windows glowed faintly, and though the hour was late, he saw movement inside. Samuel's figure unmistakable in his cassock, and beside him a woman whose posture was intimately familiar. His wife. They were too close, their voices too soft, and when Samuel reached for her hand, Daniel froze in the shadows, bile rising in his throat. But instead of storming inside, he waited, heart hammering, until Samuel left the room for wine. Then Daniel crept closer, careful as a thief, and through the half-open window he saw it. Letters on the desk, her handwriting interwoven with Samuel's pages of stolen affection, laid bare like confessions of their betrayal. When the house fell silent again, Daniel returned later, slipping in through the side door with a key he still carried from his years of church service. His hands shook as he rifled through the desk, every second a risk of discovery, but fortune seemed to conspire with him. Tucked beneath sermon drafts and parish notes was a bundle tied with ribbon, letters marked by her perfume, words no husband should ever have to read. "My dearest Samuel, I feel alive only in your presence. Your touch is my salvation." Daniel's chest tightened, yet he forced himself to keep reading, each line burning the wound deeper, but also sharpening his resolve. This was not hearsay, not rumor. This was proof, undeniable and damning. He slipped the bundle into his coat, the watch pressing against it as though binding their fates together. By the time he stepped back into the rain, the fear had drained from him, replaced by a cold certainty. The whispers had become evidence, and evidence would become the weapon. The letters burned against my chest like live coals, as I walked home through the rain, each word seared into my mind, each phrase a wound and a weapon both. By the time I set them down on my kitchen table beside my father's silver watch, I no longer trembled with grief, but with a cold, focused clarity. These pages were Samuel's undoing, but a weapon is useless without a strategy for its use. If I stormed into the church waving them, he would deny, twist, cloak himself in Scripture, and the congregation, hungry to believe in their priest's holiness, would shield him. No, I would need precision, patience, and a stage so public, so undeniable, that his mask could never be worn again. I thought of Anna's steady presence, of her whispered promise to stand by me, and I knew I could not do this alone. The letters were the heart of the plan, but they required witnesses, allies, and timing. I began to sketch the shape of it in the margins of my journal. First, secure the evidence in multiple places. Copies hidden. Originals locked away. Second, confide in only those I trusted beyond question, starting with Anna. Third, prepare the setting. A moment where Samuel would stand before his flock, expecting reverence, and instead meet revelation. The church itself would be the stage. The community, the jury. The letters would be read not as gossip, but as testimony. And when the truth rang out, Samuel would have nowhere left to run, no cloak left to hide beneath. My father's watch ticked beside the pile of letters, steady as a heartbeat, as if reminding me, time moves forward. Justice waits for no man. For the first time since that night of discovery, I felt not only the ache of betrayal, but the stirring of purpose. Revenge was no longer a shadow whispering in the dark. It had become a plan, sharp and deliberate, and soon it would be set into motion. The plan had a spine now, a sequence of moments I could picture with unbearable clarity, and what it needed next were hands to steady it, voices to validate it, and eyes to witness it. After the holiday chaos, after the church doors had slammed behind a crowd buzzing with scandal, I did not sleep for more than a few scattered hours. I moved like a man living in the thin hours between dusk and dawn, piecing together what I had stolen from Samuel's desk into neat stacks, making copies, hiding originals in places no one would think to look. The watch lay beside them as if it were an accomplice, its tiny tick a metronome for my resolve. But weapons must be wielded by more than one arm. I needed allies who could bear the cost of speaking truth in a town that still smelled of piety. The first person I went to was my sister Margaret. She had always been blunt in ways that cut cleanly. She disliked compromise and had a rapport in town that made people listen. I found her at the bakery, dusting flour from her apron, and for a half-second she looked like the woman who had held me as a child when storms shook the roof, solid, unflinching. I did not waste time on preamble. I slid the bundle of photocopies across the counter and watched her face change as she read, slow at first, then hardening into the expression I knew well. "This is wrong," she said simply, and I could hear the moral chord striking in her voice, anger sharpened by a sense of violation on behalf of everyone who trusted Samuel. She did not ask many questions. She said she would stand with me quietly, that she would begin to listen and to prod at the edges where gossip hides. Next I sought out Tom Riley, the retired cop who lived 2 streets over and kept the sort of eyes that do not miss small things. Tom had been a constable here for 30 years before the department shifted and younger men took over. He smelled of tobacco and old coffee, and there was a steadiness about him that calmed me. I brought him the originals, carefully wrapped, and I did not try to dramatize the theft. I told him what I had found, how I had taken the letters, how I had recorded conversations. He listened, his weathered face unreadable, then asked one practical question after another: chain of custody, backups, who else knew? When I told him Margaret had read them and I had made copies, he nodded once and said, "Good, you don't want this to be a he said, she said. You want witnesses, and you want a trail that can't be burned with a single lie." Tom offered an unexpected but invaluable suggestion: document everything further. He produced a small ledger from his jacket, like a man who kept records of more than fishing trips, dates, times, interactions. "If we need to involve the bishop or the police," he said, tapping the ledger, "we'll need more than anger. We'll need paper that tells the same story the letters do." His calm practicality steadied the shaking parts of me. I felt, for the first time since that night in the rectory, that my plan had the kind of architecture that might actually hold. By the time I left Tom's house, dusk had fallen, and the watch glinted coldly in my pocket. I'd recruited 2 people who would not be swayed by sentiment or sermons: Margaret with her moral bluntness and Tom with his insistence on process. They would be my quiet bulwarks while I set the stage for a public unmasking. Standing on Tom's porch, I made Margaret swear she would not speak prematurely. I made Tom vow to keep copies in a secure place. We had entered a covenant of sorts, one bound not by prayer bread and wine but by fact and cold evidence. The cost, I knew, would be high, but the time for hesitating was over. With allies at my side and evidence secured, The path ahead began to sharpen into something I could almost see, as if the watch in my pocket were ticking out the steps of destiny. Margaret's moral fire and Tom's pragmatic caution had steadied me, but the weight of execution still pressed on my shoulders. I knew Samuel's strength lay in his pulpit, in the way his words echoed from stone walls and sank into the marrow of the congregation. If he were to be undone, it would have to be there before the eyes that adored him, so that denial could not smother the truth. The question that gnawed at me now was timing. To expose him in a casual service would risk chaos, whispers turning into rumor without resolution. No, it had to be during a gathering too large and solemn to dismiss, one where every ear would be forced to hear, and every witness would carry the truth beyond the church doors. The answer arrived almost on its own: the Easter Vigil. It was months away, long enough to gather strength, but close enough that I could keep my anger alive, feeding on purpose rather than despair. Easter was the high point of the church year, the night when candles banished darkness and renewal was proclaimed with trumpets and bells. If Samuel preached that night, dripping with false sanctity, and the letters were revealed amidst the glow of resurrection hymns, then his mask would not merely slip, it would shatter. I began to prepare with a precision I had never brought even to my work. Copies of the letters went into sealed envelopes, some to Margaret, others to Tom, one hidden beneath the loose floorboard of my study. Notes of conversations were catalogued. Every meeting, every detail Samuel left in plain sight, I recorded. At home, the strain thickened the air. My wife moved about the house quieter than before, guilt hanging over her like a storm cloud that never broke. We did not speak of it directly, though every silence screamed. I sometimes wondered if she sensed what I was planning, if she saw the way my eyes followed the clock and the way I kept the watch in my hand as though counting down to an unseen hour. Still, I said nothing. Words between us had become weapons or wounds, and I had no energy left for either. My conversation now was with the plan, with the tick of the watch, with the allies who had sworn themselves to truth. Each night, as I extinguished the lamp, I whispered a vow into the darkness. You will stand before them, Samuel, stripped of your robes, your darkest sin revealed. And when the bell tolls that night, it will not be for your triumph, it will be for your fall. The church was packed, the scent of incense hanging thick in the air, wax candles trembling in the draught of so many bodies gathered for Easter Vigil. My father's silver watch ticked steadily in my pocket, every second counting down to the moment I had envisioned for months. Samuel stood at the altar, his voice rich and commanding, weaving scripture into golden threads that dazzled the crowd. To them he was the shepherd. To me, he was the wolf in the robe. I could feel Margaret's presence a few pews behind, her gaze fixed like steel, and Tom at the side aisle, hands folded, watching with the patience of a man who had built cases before. I waited until Samuel's sermon swelled to its peak, his words echoing about light and redemption, when silence hung thick enough to catch every syllable. That was when I rose. At first, no one moved, no one breathed. As I stepped into the aisle, my voice steady but burning. You speak of redemption, Father, but you have none to give. You stopped being a man of God the moment you betrayed my family. Gasps rippled through the congregation, shock twisting their faces as I drew from my coat the bundle of letters, her perfume still clinging faintly to the pages. I handed them to Margaret, who began to read aloud, her voice unwavering, each word striking like a bell. The silence broke into a storm, murmurs, denials, questions, but the words kept falling, damning in their intimacy. Samuel's face paled, then flushed. He tried to speak, but his voice faltered, drowned beneath the letters that revealed him not as shepherd, but as sinner. Tom stepped forward then, his presence commanding, declaring the evidence secured, the truth undeniable. The congregation turned, eyes wide, the spell of Samuel's authority unraveling before their very eyes. Some wept, others shouted, but none defended him. He reached for the altar, as though it might anchor him, but it was no longer his to claim. I felt the watch ticking like a final toll of judgment in my palm, as Samuel's voice broke into silence, stripped, exposed, and powerless. For the first time since that night in the rectory, I could breathe, not with joy, not with triumph, but with the heavy, solemn relief of a man who had carried his pain into the light. The darkest sin had been laid bare, and there was no turning back. When the church emptied that night, its candles guttering in shallow pools of wax, I lingered alone in the pews, the weight of silence pressing heavier than the crowd's gasps had minutes before. The watch in my hand ticked softly, no longer a countdown, but a reminder that time, indifferent and endless, had carried me to this place of ruin and revelation. Samuel was gone, escorted out by officials who whispered of hearings and discipline, his robes no shield, his collar no crown. My wife sat at the back, her face pale and unreadable, a woman suspended between guilt and shame, and I did not approach her. Some chasms are too wide for words, and ours had opened long before tonight. The town would speak of what they had seen for generations, each voice retelling the moment the priest's mask fell, the letters laid bare, the betrayal no longer hidden in shadow. Yet in my chest, the victory felt less like triumph, and more like ashes, for revenge is never clean, it stains the hands that wield it, even when justice demands the blow. I walked the aisle slowly, fingertips brushing the wood of the pews, polished by decades of folded hands, and I thought of the faith that once lived in me, bright and unbroken. It was gone now, not murdered by doubt, but by the man who was meant to guard it. Perhaps that was Samuel's truest crime, not that he betrayed my wife, but that he severed the thread between me and the God I once trusted. I stepped outside into the cool night, the bell above the church tower silent, the stars indifferent, and I felt both emptied and freed. The watch ticked against my palm, the same sound it made in my father's time, steady and faithful, untouched by sin. It was the only rhythm I could still believe in. As I walked home, the village asleep around me, I whispered a line into the darkness. Not for Samuel, not for my wife, but for myself. Some sins are not forgiven, they are faced. And with that truth, steady in my bones, I crossed the threshold of my house, knowing nothing would be the same, but also knowing I had carried the wound into light. The priest who slept with my wife had finally faced his darkest sin, and it had caught up to him.